The knock came just after 2:30 p.m., sharp enough to cut through the quiet, the kind that makes your stomach tighten before your mind catches up. Sunlight was spilling across my kitchen floor, dust floating in it, and I remember thinking how ordinary everything looked for a moment that didn't feel ordinary at all. My hand rested on the counter, steady on the outside, while something old and instinctive warned me this visit wasn't about kindness. If you've ever felt your life shift in a single second like that, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. You're not as alone as you think. When I opened the door, I saw certainty in their posture. Paperwork clutched like a conclusion already written. I knew then they believed I would cooperate, that I would shrink the way I always had. They didn't know what I'd been holding on to in silence, or how much strength can grow when someone assumes you have none. That knock wasn't the end of my story. It was the moment everything finally began to surface. The knock came in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, soft but certain, the kind that makes you pause because it does not ask permission. I was in my kitchen, sunlight on the counter, when a sudden heaviness settled in my chest. In that instant, I knew something was about to change. When I opened the door, my daughter-in-law, Rachel, stood there, composed and distant. Beside her was a man in a dark suit. A folder held tight against him. An old instinct surfaced, the kind you earn after decades of watching people say one thing while meaning another. I had lived long enough to recognize when help arrives with conditions attached. I stepped aside and invited them in, moving slowly, aware of how easily calm is mistaken for weakness. The house felt quiet, as if it were listening. I noticed how Rachel's eyes passed over me and moved to the walls and furniture, measuring the space. The man waited patiently. Confident this visit would be easy, they believed I was alone. They believed I would comply. What they did not know was that this moment was not the beginning of my loss. It was the moment the balance began to shift, to understand how. I need to take you back to who I was before any of this began. I had lived in that house for more than 3 decades, long enough for every room to carry a version of me. I was a widow, a mother, and someone who believed stability was a kind of love. My days followed a gentle rhythm. Morning coffee by the window, the same chair at the kitchen table, quiet tasks done without hurry. The house held memories in ordinary places. Pencil marks on a door frame where my son grew taller, a loose floorboard that always creaked near the hallway. Evenings spent folding laundry while the television murmured in the background. None of it felt lonely to me. It felt earned. I had learned, over the years, to take up less space. Motherhood taught me that sacrifice was natural, that stepping back was a sign of grace. When my son grew older, I told myself my job was to support quietly, not interfere, not demand attention. Love, I believed, meant trusting others to move forward without me. Aging made that belief feel reasonable. Friends downsized. Neighbors moved closer to their children. I stayed, content in familiarity, certain that being needed was less important than being considerate. What I did not notice then were the small shifts, how often I waited instead of spoke, how easily I dismissed my own unease. Change rarely announces itself loudly. Sometimes it arrives dressed as progress, and you do not realize what it is taking until much later, when someone you love begins planning a future that no longer includes your place in it, at least that day. When my son told me he was getting married, my first feeling was relief. Relief that he was happy, that his life was moving forward, that love had found him. I imagined holidays growing louder, not quieter. I imagined being folded into something larger, not edged out. I met Rachel soon after. She was polished, careful, always composed. I noticed how her attention skimmed the room rather than settling, how questions felt efficient instead of curious. None of it was rude. That was the strange part. Everything was technically kind. I told myself that different did not mean wrong. Still, there were moments that unsettled me. Visits felt brief, as if time with me required endurance. I found myself editing my stories, shortening my sentences, trying not to take up too much space. When discomfort surfaced, I smoothed it over in my own mind, She was adjusting. I was older. These things happened. I wanted harmony more than honesty. I believed peace came from patience, from letting younger people lead. When small dismissals appeared, I reframed them as misunderstandings. When I felt invisible, I blamed sentimentality. Love, I reminded myself, required flexibility. There was a tightness I carried without naming it, a sense that I was being evaluated rather than welcomed. I told myself maturity meant acceptance, that my role was changing naturally. I practiced smiling through it, believing discomfort was temporary and love would eventually settle everything into place once the celebration arrived and emotions calmed down later on. Looking back, I see how carefully I avoided conflict, how often I chose silence because it felt generous. I convinced myself that if I stayed agreeable, everything would find its balance. I did not realize then that these quiet signals were not passing moments. They were early markers. I would understand that clearly on the wedding day, when what I had ignored could no longer be softened or explained away. I woke before sunrise on the morning of the wedding, moving through my house slowly, as if the day required care. I chose a simple dress, one that felt respectful and proud, and I told myself I was ready. This was supposed to be a beginning, a moment when families blended and love expanded at the ceremony. The first unease came quietly. I realized my seat was far back, behind people I barely knew. From there, I had to lean forward to see my son. The distance felt symbolic before it felt painful. I reminded myself not to overthink it, not to make the day about me. The reception brought more small separations. Introductions passed without my name. Conversations moved around me instead of through me. I noticed how often I was described only in relation to what I could provide, not who I was. Each moment was minor on its own, but together they formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. When it came time for speeches, I had prepared words filled with memory and gratitude. I stood when invited, steadying my breath, and began to share what lived in my heart. The applause came too soon. Swallowing the rest of what I meant to say, I sat down smiling, my hands folded, while something inside me quietly collapsed. Throughout the evening, I watched my son move easily through the room, surrounded, celebrated. I waited without announcing myself. I left without causing a scene. I told myself dignity mattered more than attention, even as disappointment settled in my chest and refused to leave. Quiet, but heavy. Following every step I took toward the exit, the drive home felt longer than usual. By the time I closed my front door, I understood something had shifted. I had not just attended a wedding, I had been placed at the edge of a life that once centered around me, and the silence that followed made that clear. That understanding stayed with me long after the music ended and the lights dimmed. I expected the quiet after the wedding to feel temporary. I told myself they were busy, settling into routines, learning how to be married. Days passed slowly. I checked my phone more often than I admitted. Filling the silence with excuses meant to protect my heart. When my son did reach out, his voice felt careful in my memory, polite in a way that made me pause. Conversations stayed brief. Plans remained undefined. I began to sense that access to him now required permission rather than familiarity. I blamed timing, stress, anything that allowed me to avoid asking harder questions. One afternoon, I baked his favorite cookies, a habit rooted in years of showing love through small efforts. I drove over without calling first, carrying hope quietly. The visit ended before it began. I remember standing at the door, holding what I had brought, realizing I was no longer expected to step inside. I returned home feeling unsettled, moving through rooms that suddenly felt larger. I replayed every interaction, wondering what I had done wrong. Maybe I talked too much, maybe I expected too much. I searched for fault because responsibility felt easier than rejection. But as the days continued, the pattern remained. Distance was consistent, silence was deliberate, and in that quiet, a painful truth began to form. This was not just adjustment or misunderstanding, something fundamental had shifted, and it was not something I could fix alone myself. I could not sleep that night. The house was quiet in a way that pressed against me, and I lay awake replaying every moment, every silence. Every choice I thought I had made wrong. Guilt has a way of sounding convincing when no one interrupts it. Near midnight, I got out of bed and stood in the hallway, surrounded by shadows and familiar walls. I thought of my husband then, of the steadiness he carried through life. He used to remind me that love should never cost a person their footing, that care without respect slowly turns into control. I had brushed those words aside for years, assuming they were caution meant for someone else. I opened the small safe in the closet, the one I rarely touched. Inside were papers I had organized long ago, practical things tied to choices I had once made confidently. Holding them, I felt something shift. These were not relics of the past. They were proof that I had lived independently, thoughtfully, and with intention. For the first time since the wedding, I stopped asking what I had done wrong. The sadness did not disappear, but it settled into something firmer, clarity. I realized this was not about my failure as a mother. It was about control disguised as concern. And in that quiet moment, I decided I would start paying attention, not apologizing. After that night, the tone of things changed. Calls came more often, wrapped in concern. Questions about my energy, my safety, my future arrived gently, almost tenderly. Each one sounded reasonable on its own, and that was what made them difficult to resist. I noticed how the same phrases returned, sometimes from Rachel, sometimes from my son, as if rehearsed. Worry about the size of my house, comments about maintenance, stairs, risks that come with age, suggestions about simplifying, about letting someone else handle decisions so I could rest. Rest was always the word used. At first, I listened politely. I nodded, offered reassurances, said I was managing well, but the concern did not fade. It tightened. It began to arrive with timelines and urgency, with the implication that waiting would be irresponsible. I started to feel studied rather than supported. What unsettled me most was the coordination. The same ideas delivered in the same order, days apart, voices changing but messages identical. It felt less like conversation and more like strategy. Care does not usually sound scripted. Love leaves room for questions. This did not. I began paying attention to what was missing. No one asked what I wanted. No one asked how I felt about leaving my home. The concern moved in one direction only, toward control of space and money. Framed as protection. That was when the word formed clearly in my mind. This was not care. It was preparation. And once I saw that, I knew I could not face it alone. I needed clarity beyond my own thoughts, a steadier voice to confirm what my instincts were telling me, and permission to trust myself enough to ask for guidance before any decision was forced into motion from someone who had no stake in my silence. I called my friend Laura after days of hesitation. Saying things out loud felt risky, like admitting doubt meant inviting trouble. But once I began, the weight shifted. She listened without interrupting, and in her quiet attention I felt something return to me. Perspective. She did not dismiss my worries or rush to explain them away. Instead, she named what I was describing as pressure, not care. Hearing that from someone who loved me but had nothing to gain was grounding. It reminded me that intuition is not paranoia when it is consistent. A few days later, I sat across from a professional whose calm experience filled the room. As I laid out the pattern, I watched recognition settle in his expression. He explained how manipulation often begins softly, especially within families, using concern to create urgency and dependence. Isolation first, control later. Nothing he said felt dramatic. That was the relief. It was practical, measured, and familiar to him, which told me this was not rare and I was not foolish. I left with simple guidance: document everything, sign nothing without independent advice, and trust the discomfort I had been minimizing. Walking home, I felt steadier than I had in weeks. The fear was still there, but it no longer stood alone. I understood what I was facing fully. I knew the tone had shifted the moment they returned with folders instead of conversation. The visit was framed as practical, efficient, something that needed to be handled before it became complicated. Papers were spread across my table, neat and authoritative, carrying the weight of final decisions disguised as assistance. Everything was presented as routine, forms meant to simplify, arrangements meant to protect. Time, I sensed, was being used as leverage. The language pressed forward, nudging me toward agreement before questions could settle. I felt the room tighten around me. I played the part they expected. I leaned in, squinted at pages, let my hands tremble just enough to suggest uncertainty. Inside, I was cataloging details, the order of the documents, the phrases that implied permanence, the absence of alternatives. Each page narrowed my future further. What unsettled me most was how confidently it was assumed I would comply, as if my consent were inevitable, as if my life were already being reorganized without my participation. I understood then that this was not a discussion. It was a process designed to end one way. I kept my voice soft in my own memory, asking for time, for space to think. The response I felt was polite but firm, urgency wrapped in reassurance, waiting. I sensed, was no longer encouraged. As they prepared to leave, I sat alone with the echo of their presence and the realization that this was the final step. The next meeting would not allow hesitation. Whatever happened next would decide whether I kept my autonomy or surrendered it quietly. I breathed slowly, knowing preparation was finished and resolve would matter more than fear now for me. They came back on a quiet afternoon, confident this time. The papers were thicker, the process already moving in their minds. I felt the familiar pressure settle in the room. That sense of momentum meant to carry me forward without resistance. Outwardly, I was calm. Inside, I was steady in a way I had not been before. I had prepared for this moment without letting it show. Every suggestion to hurry, every assumption of my agreement, landed against a boundary they could not see. I listened, nodded, let the weight of the document sit between us. I no longer felt small. I felt ready. Then the doorbell rang. The sound cut cleanly through the room, stopping everything. I stood slowly, aware of the sudden shift in energy, and opened the door to find exactly what I had arranged: support, presence, balance. The room changed the moment they stepped inside. The confidence I had been watching so closely wavered, just slightly, like a structure losing its center. I took my seat again, feeling the difference settle. The urgency drained away, the language softened, papers were gathered instead of pushed forward. What had been presented as inevitable suddenly required reconsideration. I did not raise my voice or accuse anyone. I simply held my ground. In that moment, I understood how much power preparation gives. Not power over others, but power over your own life. I was no longer reacting. I was choosing. The boundaries I had rehearsed quietly were now clear, unmovable, and entirely my own. The meeting ended without drama. No signatures, no final decisions, just a quiet retreat and a space reclaimed. When the door closed behind them, the house felt different. Not triumphant, not victorious, just peaceful. I sat alone for a while afterward, letting the silence settle. The fear that had followed me for months loosened its grip. I had not won anything. I had protected something, my right to decide, my right to pause, my right to exist without being managed. And in that stillness, relief replaced tension, slow and real, as the moment passed and left me standing firmly in myself. I expected to feel something dramatic after they left, but what came instead was quiet. The house returned to its familiar sounds, and for the first time in months, that quiet did not feel threatening. It felt earned. There was no victory speech, no moment of satisfaction, just a steady calm that settled in as I moved through my rooms, aware that nothing had been taken from me. I had simply stopped giving ground. In the days that followed, communication changed. It became slower, more careful. I chose my responses with intention, answering only what needed answering, leaving space where pressure once lived. I did not explain myself in long paragraphs. I did not argue. I held boundaries the way you hold something fragile but necessary. I stayed in my home for a while longer, not because I was proving a point, but because the choice was mine. Later, when I did decide to make changes, they came from reflection, not fear. Each decision carried my voice, my timing. What surprised me most was how little I needed anyone else to understand. Peace arrived without agreement. Respect did not require apology. The tension that had defined my days dissolved quietly, replaced by something sturdier. I realized then that this was never about winning. It was about ownership of my space, my time, my future. That dignity stayed with me intact. I spent many years believing that being a good mother meant shrinking quietly as my child grew. I believed sacrifice was proof of love, and silence was kindness. What this experience taught me is that those beliefs, when taken too far, can erase a person. Love does not require obedience, care does not demand control, and age does not cancel the right to decide how you live. I am still a mother. I am still capable of compromise and tenderness, but I am also a woman with agency. And that truth does not disappear when my role changes. Boundaries did not make me colder. They made my relationships clearer. If any part of this story feels familiar, I want you to hear this gently. Trust the quiet discomfort you keep explaining away. Take time before you agree. Ask questions. Seek advice that has no interest in your silence. Real love will wait. It will listen. It will respect your no. What saved me was not confrontation. It was preparation, patience, and the willingness to choose myself without guilt. Thank you for sitting with my story and holding space for it. If you have ever faced a moment where love and control felt tangled together, I would truly like to hear about it. What helped you find your footing again? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read everyone here.